KC is a undergraduate and PhD from Harvard with a master's degree from University of Chicago. He is a widely published writer whose books have, I think, perhaps most notably covered the presidential election of 1964 all the way with LBJ. His book that you might have already encountered, I stumbled on the title of this, let me check, Until Proven Innocent, Political Correctness and the Shameful Injustices of the Duke Lacrosse Rape Case. I don't think it would be going too far to say that without Casey's involvement in raising questions on his blog, Durham and Wonderland, the infamous Duke rape case, lacrosse team rape case, would not have fallen apart as dramatically as it did, and further injustices would have been done. So Casey Johnson is a important scholar. He teaches at Brooklyn College and the City University of New York Graduate Center. He is also a resident of Maine and knows Bowdoin College pretty well. I'm going to turn it over to Casey.
I'm going to be talking some about the nature of U.S. history, how U.S. history is taught and not taught on college campuses, but I wanted to start with a couple of general remarks. This gentleman here is Justin Morrill, who was a Republican senator from Vermont in the 1850s and 1860s. For scholars of higher education, he's best known for sponsoring the Morrill Act, which I have excerpted there, which established the land-grant colleges in the United States. Really an extraordinary and unprecedented expansion of higher education in world affairs in the 19th century. Among the land institutions are the University of Maine. And the Morrill Act called for the requirement in exchange for government funding for institutions to teach what Congress considered to be the nature of citizenship in the 19th century, which at that time was cultural and military. Now, the Morrill Act is long past, but schools which are not land-grant institutions nonetheless have, by and large, accepted this obligation to teach future generations of U.S. citizens. These are mission statements from institutions around the country that make this promise. And these are mission statements from institutions here in Maine, ranging from Presque Isle to Bowdoin, that have as their formal statement that they will be teaching the next generation of citizens. Now, as Peter pointed out, you can see the Bowdoin promise of citizenship and its mission statement at the bottom. President Mills has modified this, even though the modification hasn't quite made it into the citizen statement, to say that Bowdoin's mission is not to train future U.S. citizens, but to train future global citizens. But even if we remove Bowdoin from the list, I think we can infer that most of the rest of the institutions of higher education in Maine see it as part of their mission to train the next generation of U.S. citizens. For those institutions on the list which are public institutions, this is a promise to the taxpayers of Maine, who in part fund these institutions to engage in this effort. Now, we can, and lots of people do, debate what might entail a training of a future generation of citizens. I don't think it's even exceptional from the American standpoint to make the case that if you're going to train the future generation of citizens of a country, they need to know the foundations of the nation's history, of the interaction between government and people in a country like the United States, the interaction between the U.S. and world affairs. And that, by and large, is not occurring, or it's occurring in very odd ways on today's campuses. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. A couple of caveats. I'm going to be talking exclusively about the instruction in U.S. history for two reasons. The first is that there's a clear connection between citizenship and the instruction of U.S. history. And U.S. history is one of the areas higher education, where there's a much greater ability for non-faculty to have some influence over the curriculum. Secondly, for those of you outside of the academy, within history programs, U.S. history, except for very, very large history departments, U.S. history is the one area where departments hire on the basis of themes and approaches to history, African American history or military history or women's history. And so the way in which departments select themselves, you can get a better sense of their values by looking at U.S. history than, say, the history of Japan, where most departments will only have one or in some cases 0 historians. All right. So traditional U.S. history, the study of history in American colleges and universities at an extensive level expands after World War II. In the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, U.S. history was generally taught as a top-down approach. And the emphasis within faculty members, within publications, these are some of the leading publications of the era, was U.S. political history, the study of U.S. public policy, the interaction between politics and government. U.S. diplomatic history, study of U.S. foreign policy, the nature of interaction between U.S. and world affairs. U.S. military history, doesn't need a description. U.S. constitutional history, study of the Supreme Court decisions and this sort of thing. U.S. intellectual history, study of broad-based ideas. That approach, and if you looked at basically any history department through the, say, mid 1960s, its Americanist contingent would be dominated by these types of history. That approach comes under challenge in 2 waves. The first is in the late 60s into the early 70s with the wave of social historians coming out of Vietnam, the civil rights movement making what I think was the correct critique, that to fully understand the American past, we need to understand both the history from below and the history from above. So departments started hiring in African American history and women's history and social history and this sort of thing. But in the late 90s and continuing really more or less unabated, departments began to change more dramatically. A decade ago, I took a look at the 3 largest public university history departments, not just public history departments, because presumably they would be more influenced by the need to accommodate state legislatures. And at that time, only 3 of the top 30, Virginia, Ohio State, and Alabama, still had a majority of their U.S. historians who studied these more traditional approaches, political, diplomatic, military, constitutional. And since 2003, one of those 3, Ohio State, has dropped off the list. They're around 45%. The reason for this is this second wave that of approaches that began in the late 1990s and has continued, caused by 2 developments. The first were that these social historians, as they became majorities within departments, relatively non-tolerant of those with more traditional pedagogical approaches. They were welcomed in, but they didn't come in. Others departments had this tendency to self-replicate. The second, and sort of enhancing this, was this increased emphasis on certain types of diversity, race, class, and gender, not pedagogical, intellectual diversity. And at public and really at most private universities, faculty positions cannot be posted in such a way saying, I want to hire only African Americans for this position. The result is that departments and colleges are creative in how they craft lines, enhance the hiring of more diverse candidates. And so, for instance, in U.S. history, if your goal is to hire a minority or a woman, you're more likely to get such a candidate if you post a line in the history of African American women than you are if you post a line in U.S. military history. This doesn't mean that you might not get a great black woman in a U.S. military historian. You might not a ultra-conservative white male, history of African American women, but all other things being equal, you're more likely to get the diverse candidate posting in the latter. And the result is that history departments around the country have increasingly looked more like this department, the University of Michigan, which is regularly ranked as among the top 10 history departments in the country, with this very heavy emphasis on race and gender. And ethnic identities among their Americanist contingent. And if you look down at the bottom in terms of the lower charts, one thing you don't see at all is military history. Military history has essentially been eliminated from higher education, with the exception of the military academies and some mostly public universities in the South. Similarly, U.S. constitutional history, very few institutions still higher in U.S. constitutional history. The field has essentially migrated to law schools, and if students don't go to law school, they're pretty much out of luck if they want to study with a specialist in U.S. Constitutional history. But as you see from Michigan, and by the way, Bowdoin's, the breakdown in Bowdoin's history department is more or less similar to this approach, with the exception that 1/3 of the Americanists in Bowdoin's history department are specialists in the environmental history of the American West, which is somewhat odd, but essentially Bowdoin's approach is similar. They have one more or less traditional political historian, and the rest specialize in race, class, gender, or environmental history. You do see, though, in Michigan that there are a handful of people who are studying U.S. political history, U.S. Diplomatic history. But these numbers are a little bit deceptive, because within these two remaining traditional subfields, there have been significant shifts as well to accommodate the new norms. In political history, the movement has been towards hiring in what are called new political historians. The clarion call for this was this 1995 piece in the American Historical Review that I have excerpted here by Mark Leff, who's a historian at the University of Illinois. And Leff and those who follow him, which are really sort of a majority, I think, in U.S. history departments, argue that there are only two approaches, that there is traditional political history, which is simply celebrating the American past, saying everything that the United States did was good, having political historians who study race, class, and gender. The movement has been for to have political historians who are focusing on the latter approach. I should note, by the way, that this sort of cross-pollination only occurs in one direction. You don't see departments whose specialists are, say, African-American historians who study, maybe write a sympathetic biography of Clarence Thomas or Ward Connerly, would technically be African-American historians, but these are not the kinds of African-American history that want to hire in. And so what passes as political history is frequently race, class, or gender history simply revised. And within diplomatic history, there have been a couple of shifts as well. There's been a movement towards internationalism or transnationalism, which in a lot of ways yields really quite interesting results, but has its limits. You can't study the making of U.S. foreign policy from an exclusively transnationalist agenda. And then this Rotter book that I have here on the right is an example of another pattern within diplomatic history to study things like racism in American foreign policy or the use of gendered language, sometimes interesting questions, but really not central questions to the making of U.S. Foreign policy. And so when you see a history department that may still have 5 or 10 or 15% of its contingent studying these more traditional diplomatic or political history topics, if you look a little more closely, frequently what you're seeing is race, class, gender simply There are occasional instances in which the sort of veil is uncovered in terms of the hiring process in interesting and really comfortable ways. And the most recent of these occurred at the University of Iowa a few years ago. Posted a position in diplomatic history. For people outside of the academy, the hiring process in academic affairs is incredibly opaque. No one from the outside is present in looking at these applications, present looking at the talks that the candidates give, so it's very, very hard to know exactly what department encountered. But the Iowa case was a little different. One of the applicants was this guy named Mark Moyer, who had published 2 books at the time that he had applied. Both well-received, although controversial, studies of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam made the case that the war was a successful military effort where the military was undermined by the civilians. You could take around 30 seconds of a Google search, and there's no doubt that the Iowa history department did, and search Mark Moyer's name to also realize that he is a very, very conservative figure. Moyer applied for the job. He didn't get it. That wasn't much of a surprise. What was a surprise is that he wasn't chosen as among the 10 semifinalists. Iowa decided that this candidate, 2 books published by a prestigious press on Vietnam, would even be in the top 10. And Moyer at this point had basically given up on the idea of getting a full-time academic position, and so he decided to go public with his criticism. And he made a claim that there was some sort of ideological discrimination. At the fact that there were no registered Republicans in the Iowa history department. And he filed a complaint with the University of Iowa, which was denied on sort of technical grounds. And then he went public. Generally, when academic institutions get criticized, their best approach is to say nothing, because when they say anything, it tends to prove the critic's case. And this is what happened at the University of Iowa. The department chairman denied that there was any ideological discrimination hiring, although there was this 100% ratio, on the grounds that the majority of citizens of Johnson County, which is where the University of Iowa is located, are Democrats. The problem is that the University of Iowa doesn't exclusively recruit from Johnson County, so it doesn't matter how many Democrats there were in Johnson County. You should note that these partisan affiliations are really a crude measurement. No one would confuse me with a defender of the status quo. I'm a Democrat. I'm a registered Democrat, partisan Democrat. Nonetheless, when you get a pattern of 22-0, it might suggest that there's something wrong. The chairman's remarks were mild compared to the remarks of the U.S. women's historian in the department, who suggested that there's no downside at all to having a department that consists of no Republicans, and an all-Democratic approach is really the way to go. The University of Iowa, in Moyar's place, hired a diplomatic historian whose work focused on racism in the U.S. occupation of the Philippines in the 1890s, and he taught at Iowa not a traditional survey in U.S. diplomatic history, but a course that he called Race and the American Empire. Okay, so you have this change. It's a somewhat uncomfortable change. There are, in some ways, it's an unprecedented change in terms of how history is instructed. History is not like biology or psychology, where arguments can simply be proved wrong. The default position in history is that knowledge always expands. And instead, what we've seen in higher education over the last 20 years is this really quite conscious decision to restrict areas of knowledge, to make it less likely, and in some cases to make it impossible for students even to encounter specialists in certain kinds of history. This is well beyond the sorts of things that Peter was talking about, the lack of requirements. In this case, even if it were required, there would be no one there to teach these courses. What are the defenses that are made? There are sort of 3 primary defenses that those who sort of represent the status quo offer. President Mills' response, which Peter mentioned in the Daily Sun, embodies some of these. I've used Mills's words here as representatives of broader sentiments in the academy. Most college and university presidents would have said the same things that Mills did. The first argument is that we don't need to worry about the fact that traditional approaches to the American past are no longer offered in higher education. Students get the information at high school anyway. This is a very peculiar argument. We generally don't make the case that high school level instruction is sufficient for college, otherwise you wouldn't really need college at all. And secondly, as I'll talk about in a couple of minutes, there's a much closer relationship between college instruction and high school instruction than this Mills comment and the general defense offers. Second argument, which Mills also raised, is that even if there aren't specialists in these more traditional approaches to the American past, it doesn't matter, because students might be able to encounter traditional topics in coursework. This is a reversal of the complaints in the 1960s and 70s. One of the reasons why people argued, I think correctly, that we needed specialists in, say, African American history or women's history and departments is that non-specialists were not equipped to teach these sorts of courses. The whole purpose of college is for students to encounter courses with those who have specialized knowledge. To test this theory, I took a look last year at the course offerings at UCLA, which also is a top history department and has been very aggressive at eliminating more traditional approaches among its historians. UCLA is unusual because they have more curricular information online than most institutions do. Last falls ago, the semester, they had 14 courses in U.S. histories other than straight surveys. 12 of them dealt with either race, class, gender issues or economic issues, but 2 dealt with more traditional approaches. One was this course in U.S. social movements in the 60s and 70s. Second was a course in American empire, so it was sort of political history course and a diplomatic history. The reading list, the complete reading list for the social history course I have here in the left. I suspect that there are few, if any of you, who have read any of these books, but you can get a sense of what the books are arguing from the title. If you think of the history of the 1960s and 70s, there were lots of important left-wing social movements that occurred during these periods. But there are also some quite significant, more conservative social movements that are occurring during these periods. The pro-life movement really originates at a political level in the late 60s and into the early 1970s. If you look towards the end of this period, we have the anti-tax movement, Proposition 13 in California, a very powerful grassroots movement. You have Anita Bryant running around in the late 70s as well. They're all significant social movements that simply don't appear because the instructor in this course lies solely in left-wing movements. On the course of American empires, there's a description here of the historiography. That's a description of the historiography that would be accurate as of 1963 or so. But this is what happens when you have a non-specialist teaching the field. You have this imagined interpretation of the past. So this idea that you can have non-specialists teaching good courses seems to me rather a weak defense. And then the last defense, which President Mills offered and which is common, is that we don't really need to worry about these issues because after all, political science more or less teaches about the American past anyway. And there's lots of good work in political science. This journal that I have here, Studies in American Political Development, does work. The problem is that this is a description without an explanation. 30 years ago, political science did a lot of good work on American founders as well. That doesn't really explain why colleges have chosen to eliminate of U.S. So why should any of this matter? Apart from what might be considered an old-fashioned idea that if colleges say they are going to train the next generation of citizens, they should actually do it, especially if they're a public college accepting taxpayers' money for that promise. I wanted to offer 2 additional arguments why this is significant outside of the academy and why people outside of the academy should be concerned and should press. First dates with this connection between high school and college instruction. Academic freedom, overly simplified, means that professors need to have the freedom to teach what they want and that outsiders really don't have any role in dictating what is or is not taught in the classroom, and that's more or less practiced everywhere. There are a few areas where there is something of an exception to this, a custom where outsiders effectively do have some. And that deals with areas where there is a connection between higher education and what's taught in the public schools. And if you think of the key topics here, they're English, essentially U.S. history, and their areas within the sciences. All states have more or less similar structures where they'll have Board of Education, sometimes appointed by a governor, sometimes popularly elected. Those boards have a responsibility for setting broad approaches that all students in public schools in these states learn. These, of course, are Maine social studies learning goals, and they're all more or less done the same way, through the political branch, political representatives, charting structures, inviting public for comment, and working with specialists, both teachers and professors, to design the. And if you look at some of these learning goals, there is an expectation of a more, what we would call a traditional approach to the American past, understanding American presidents, the American foundation, U.S. wars, and this sort of thing. Similar approach in New York. Maine and New York are not red states. These are fairly liberal states. There are states with learning goals that are far more overtly conservative than either Maine or New York. Virtually every state assumes in high schools, students learn basic foundations of what we call traditional political or diplomatic or military or constitutional history. There is, however, a connection between this and colleges. Most states require, in the case of New York, or very strongly encourage, in the case of nearly every other state, by incentivizing through salary increase, high school social studies teachers to get master's degrees. And the effect of this is a massive transfer of money, among other things, from the pockets of public school teachers into the coffers of institutions that offer master programs. My own Brooklyn College does. The institution survived in a lot of ways because of the money coming from this sort of thing. Now, states aren't doing this out of the goodness of their heart. They're working under the expectation that when students get knowledge in these master's programs, they will then bring it to their students. If colleges don't offer courses in anything that deals with these sorts of topics that states expect to be taught, there's really very little reason for master's programs. And there are some state boards of education, mostly in states in the Southwest, that have started to raise this question in significant ways. So that's the first reason, this idea of the master's program. The second is this concern that what you see in history is more broadly representative of a growing and I think very troubling gap between the ideological midpoint within the academy and the ideological midpoint within the public at large. And although we have this impression of tenured radicals and campus activism and this sort of thing, if you think really with American history, for the most part, campus ideas, popular ideas, were really not all that different until the 1980s. It's accelerated today. I would make a case that there's a wider gap between what would be, say, the ideological point on a college campus and the ideological midpoint within society as a whole at any other point in American history. The result of this, in this wonderful article by Mark Bauerlein, which was published around a decade ago, makes a case, and I think we saw this in the response to the Bowdoin report, of a groupthink mentality on campus. One of the symptoms of this groupthink mentality is a tendency towards extreme versions of a common assumption, that if everyone or just about everyone believes the same thing, the tendency is for a more extreme view to predominate. And the problem with this is that these extremist views occasionally percolate out in high-profile instances to the public at large, creating an impression within the public. Attitudes on college campuses are even more extreme than they are, especially at public institutions, undermining necessary public support for colleges. And so even those who don't really believe in pedagogical diversity should be a self-interest in for the couple of examples of this thing in action. One high-profile one, which, as Peter mentioned, I wrote about, the Duke lacrosse case, where you had this group of 88 professors 2 weeks into the case issuing a public statement asserting that something had happened to the accuser, this woman named Crystal Mangum, just convicted for murder, and publicly thanking these protesters who had carried a sign outside of the lacrosse captain's house urging that the captain be castrated. The ideological leader of 88 was this historian, William Chafe, American historian of race, class, and gender, and provost of Duke, and had overseen the hiring of the figures who joined in the group of 88. He summarized their principles in this op-ed that was published in the Duke Chronicle a couple of weeks after the charges first surfaced. As you'll notice, he compared the lacrosse players and the attitude of the lacrosse players to the lynching of Emmett Till, but he couldn't get the actual year of the lynching correct. Facts don't really matter in these sorts of. A second and a more recent example of this sort of groupthink mentality percolating into the public mentality, recent effort by the American Studies Association, which is an organization consisting of specialists in American literature, American social affairs, and some American historians, to proclaim a academic boycott of Israel. The chairman of the association, when asked about why the ASA was boycotting Israel and not countries with far worse human rights record, responded that we have to start somewhere. And in the case of the ASA, they're going to be starting with Israel and ending with Israel. This was an episode which the ASA it passed unanimously in their national board. They didn't seem to expect a large public backlash. They got from college presidents, but especially from the media. So the problem is that we get these, when the media pays attention to higher education, which isn't a whole lot, there is this tendency to emphasize these extreme approaches. And in states, from the Times and Post articles in the last couple of months, that are increasingly moving towards one-party governments, especially in red states. If we're a professor at a university in Texas or a university in Kansas, I may be rather concerned that state legislatures will become far more active and aggressive, making the not unreasonable case that, look, these institutions are really hostile to the political values of the majority. What is the legislature doing continuing to fund these schools? All right, so what can be done about the issue? The one thing that absolutely is not going to solve it is trusting that either the current academic majority or most college presidents are going to solve the problem on their own. I don't know President Mills. It may very well be that he believes the sorts of things that he said. It may very well be simply that he likes his job and recognizes that challenging powerful elements among the faculty is the quickest way to ensure that he's going to lose his job. But Mills is sort of reflective of the attitudes of college presidents who are unlikely to challenge faculty attitudes on these sorts of issues. The last that engaged in some of these challenges was Larry Summers at Harvard, and we all know what happened to Summers. It's not going to be coming from the faculty, and it's not going to be coming from administrators. There are possibly three approaches. First is trustees. If the system of checks and balances in higher education is broken down, which I think it has, trustees need to step and play a more important role. After all, trustees at most institutions are formal body that makes hiring decisions, even though the tradition is they simply sign off on them. They are also the body responsible for the fiduciary duties of institutions. They have responsibility over the broad missions of the institutions. We have seen some examples of this. The SUNY board over the last decade is, I think, the active board. The board at the University of Colorado system during parts of the last 10 or 15 years was a particularly good model. But trustees need to step in and be much more assertive in dealing with college presidents and ask hard questions of college presidents about the nature of faculty hiring priorities. The second is more activism from alumni. It continues to amaze me that alumni make significant donations to colleges and universities, that more alumni make donations without targeting the donations far more specifically. And there are examples where alumni have sort of done a really quite positive role in expanding a kind of pedagogical approach. This LBJ School of Public Affairs is partly alumni funded and partly funded by the university is a good model. But the idea is that if faculty are not going to do it, alumni need to be more active in reestablishing a broad pedagogical diversity on campuses. And then finally, parents need to play a more active. Higher education is one of the few things in which people spend tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars without taking a close look, and in some cases without taking a look at all at what exactly they are getting for money. Institutions have increasingly in the last few years started to hide specific particular things. It's hard to, for instance, syllabi of most professors because they don't like to criticize from the outside. Parents you certainly look at departments, get a sense of who is teaching there, what they're offering, and there are subtle differences between schools. I mean, there's a big say between the University of Virginia and the University of Michigan. If you want a good education, you go to Virginia. If you want a kind of politicized education, you go to Michigan. And parents can and should make these sorts of decisions. Thanks.